When shopping for knives, I feel like there is way too much emphasis placed on steel type and not enough emphasis placed on the edge geometry of the knife that you're looking at. I'm certainly guilty of this. When I was first looking into Japanese knives, looking to make my first purchase, I was solely focused on steel type. In my mind, Algami Super or nothing is what I wanted, and I focused none of my attention on the edge geometry of the particular knives I was looking at. Over time though, as I started purchasing more and more Japanese knives and experimenting with different edge geometries, I started to learn how important the edge geometry was to the overall performance of the knife. And I would go so far as to say now that the edge geometry has more importance to the performance of the knife than the steel type does. It's also super important to maintain the edge geometry of your knife over time after you've purchased it through thinning of the blade during the sharpening process. We'll save that for our next video, but in today's video, I thought it would be fun to talk about the different grinds that you'll find, more specifically on Japanese knives, but we'll talk about European style grinds as well, and why one over the other might be better for your purposes. So before we get into it, let's have a quick word from our sponsors. Gotcha! So the three grinds that we're going to talk about today are the flat grind, the convex grind, and the hollow or concave grind. We're going to focus most of our attention on the flat and hollow or concave grinds, but we'll talk briefly about the convex grind as well. Flat ground, what is it? How does it? Yeah, here we go. So a typical flat ground knife is going to be angled in about halfway down the blade. As the name implies, the grind is going to be flat. There's going to be no convex shape to it. There's going to be no convex shape to it. It's going to be flat. It's going to angle all the way into the secondary or cutting edge on our knife. A full flat ground knife is going to angle in all the way from the spine. There's going to be no beveling aside from that until it reaches the secondary or cutting edge of our knife. Now, both of these grinds are achieved using a hard back on a belt sander or by using a sharpening wheel and then using a flat whetstone to flatten out the edge or grind after the fact. Next, we're going to talk about the convex grind. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this because they're not super typical in Japanese knives. They're more typical with European style knives, but they are achieved by using a slack belt grinder. The shape of the belt, because it's slack, is what creates the shape of the convex edge. Finally, we're going to talk about the hollow or concave ground edge. These knives, as the name implied, have a concave grind, or meaning they sort of angle in towards the center of the blade. These are achieved by using a grinding wheel. So the sort of circumference of the wheel is what creates that hollow grind on the knife. You'll also have maybe noticed that we are omitting single beveled knives from our discussion today, and that is because we try to focus on more Western style Japanese knives, more in line with a Western style of cutting or cuisine. Single beveled knives are great for Japanese preparations, but we find they don't have a true place in Western style cuisine. Hence why we will be omitting them from our conversation today, because our typical customer is a Western style chef. If there are any other grind styles, maybe like an S grind or a Scandi grind or anything like that that you have had some confusion about in the past and you'd like some clarification, leave a comment down below and we'll answer you either in comment form or in a video form in the future. So now that we understand all the different grinds, how they're achieved, let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of all of them. To help illustrate our point, Monsieur Jake, the man behind the camera, has created this wonderful graph for us. And we're going to move through this talking about which style of grind gets the edge in each of these 4, 5 categories that we have here. 4? 5? 4? 4. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 5. So again, the 3 types of grinds we're talking about are the concave or hollow ground, the flat grind, and the convex grind. The 5 categories that we're going to move through are the ease of sharpening, the food release, the strength of the edge retention / cutting feel, and finally the price. First up, ease of sharpening. We are going to give the edge to the hollow grind in this category. This is because there is less steel behind the secondary or cutting edge on these knives, which means you're going to have to remove less steel when you're sharpening it, which is going to make the process a whole lot easier. You'll find it much easier to achieve a burr on these knives, which is essential to getting your knife sharpened properly. So yes, edge to the hollow grind for ease of sharpening. Convex grinds can be difficult to sharpen because there is more material behind the cutting edge that needs to be removed in order to create our burr and new cutting edge. It's also worth noting that the shape of this grind is going to be very difficult to maintain, especially with a flat whetstone. The only real way to maintain a convex edge is with a slack belt sander, and I can't speak for everyone, but chances are you don't have one of these at home and will be using a flat whetstone to do your sharpening. So again, a little bit difficult to sharpen a convex edge and maintain a nice cutting feel on them. So it was difficult for us to give the hollow grind the edge over the flat grind in this category because when these knives are both brand new, they're both going to perform very well in this regard. Where you will really notice a difference is over time, as you continue sharpening these knives, they're going to get thicker and thicker and thicker as we move up the blade. This is going to make it more difficult to sharpen because there will be more material there for you to remove, of course, making the process more time consuming and therefore a little bit more difficult. The next category we're going to talk about is food release, and we've given the edge in this category to the flat grind because of the wedging that occurs when you use this style of edge geometry. As you push this knife through an ingredient, it's going to cause the ingredient to sort of split apart and keep it from getting stuck to the largest flat spot on your knife, which is going to cause a lot of suction and cause food to get stuck to the blade. So a close second in this category was the hollow or concave grind, and that's because the shape of this grind creates a bit of negative space between the knife and the ingredient that you're cutting. And of course, this negative space means less contact between ingredient and blade, and therefore the food will release from the blade quite a bit easier. Quick point we want to make about food release is that it's most noticeable when cutting ingredients like carrots and potatoes, those with a high hydration content and or high starch content. You won't notice food release a lot when cutting proteins or softer ingredients, so it's more noticeable when cutting, again, like carrots, potatoes, sweet potatoes, what else? Daikon, stuff like that. We gave the edge in this category to the flat grind, not to be confused with the full flat ground style of edge geometry, which is arguably the worst for food release of all of the knife grinds out there. Our next category is going to be edge retention / cutting feel. The reason why we're combining these into two is because we find knives with a good edge geometry still move through ingredients relatively well, even as they dull. And those with thicker, or in our mind, poorer edge geometry, as they dull, they do not move through ingredients very well. So the edge in this category is going to go to the hollow or concave grind, and that's because of how thin the edge on these knives are. Even as, like we said, the knife dulls at the secondary or cutting edge, because of the favorable or very thin edge geometry, these knives will move through ingredients with relative ease because of that edge geometry. Now in our last category, we talked about how the flat grind knife is good for food release, but that also is going to contribute to a less than desirable cutting feel for most of us. That wedging that occurs that helps food move away from the blade easier also means that you're pushing harder and using more force to get through an ingredient, which means a less than desirable cutting feel. The convex grind we would kind of describe similarly to the flat grind in this category. It too is going to cause wedging, and as your knife dulls, this wedging is not going to allow the knife to move through an ingredient if the secondary or cutting edge is not sharp. So at this point, you're probably noticing that there are some advantages that then cause disadvantages and disadvantages that cause advantages. And we're going to keep that going right here in the edge strength category, because in our last category, we gave the cutting feel and edge retention to the hollow grind. In this category, the hollow grind is not going to perform super well. Hollow grinds, because of how thin they are very, very delicate, very prone to chipping. So in this category, we have to give the edge to the convex grind. The convex grind has the most strength because it has the most material behind the edge. You can be very aggressive with these knives. You can roll them around the board, twist them, torque them in the board or in ingredients, and chances are they'll be no worse for the wear after you've done this. If you were to use any of these motions with either a flat grind knife or a hollow or concave grind knife, not with certainty, but with near certainty, you will cause damage, chipping, bending, warping to the blade if you were to use any of these techniques with either of these styles of knives. Generally speaking, the thicker behind the edge a knife is, the less sharp it's going to feel. Even if you've sharpened both knives to the exact same degree, because there's more steel behind the secondary edge on convex or flat ground knives, they're not going to move through ingredients as well, but they'll be much stronger. On the flip side of that, a knife that's very thin behind the edge will move through ingredients very, very easily, but it's going to be very brittle and chip easier, even if you've sharpened both styles of grinds at the exact same angle. Lastly, we're going to talk about pricing. Now, we've noticed some patterns here. Typically, in our experience, the thinner ground knives are going to be more expensive. It requires more time and effort to remove the stock from these knives to get them that thin, and it also requires a little bit more expertise and knowledge to create a knife this thin without damaging it or making an unusable product. So what we're talking about here is grinding the knife in the way that it doesn't function properly anymore, or in the quenching or heat treatment process, you might find that these super thin blades warp and crack a lot easier than thicker blades. So this, of course, is going to affect the price, as if we're losing a bunch of knives during the manufacturing process, of course, those losses are going to go into the cost of the successfully completed knives. So if we're losing less knives during the forging process or during the production, of course, we're going to be able to charge less for those knives. That isn't a rule of thumb, though, of course, because our Tetsu Kurouchi line is a hollow or concave ground knife, and it's one of the more affordable options in the shop. So look around. All of the knives on our website have a choil shot showing you the edge geometry of the knife. This, in my mind, coupled with the spine shot that we have on our website, will give you a really good understanding of the edge geometry of the particular knife that you're looking at. Like we said at the beginning of this video, maintaining the edge geometry of whatever knife you pick up is also super, super important to the longevity of the knife or the performance over time. So in our next video, which will likely be dropping in about 3 to 4 days from now, we're going to be talking about how to thin or sharpen each of these different grinds of knives. So make sure you tune in for that. Make sure you subscribe to our channel for more knife-related content. Like this video, leave a comment down below if you have any questions, and until the next video, stay sharp.